This video is entirely based on the book The Grace of God by Charles Spurgeon, a work that exposes the unfathomable depth of divine mercy and reveals that the entire Christian life is sustained by grace from the first awakening of faith to the last breath of hope. In this script, we seek to bring the essence of Spurgeon's theology to the daily practice of the modern Christian, showing that grace is not merely a doctrinal concept, but a spiritual power that transforms the heart, renews the mind, and rebuilds entire stories. Grace is the hand that lifts us up and the presence that accompanies us when we can no longer move forward alone. Spurgeon said that grace is the greatest scandal of the gospel because it reaches those who don't deserve it, sustains those who can't, forgives those who have failed, and restores those who have given up. He affirmed that grace doesn't expect perfection. It produces transformation. That's why, according to him, no one can feel too unworthy for God, because grace doesn't choose the strong. It chooses the broken. It doesn't choose the ready. It chooses those who surrender. And when grace touches someone, it not only changes their eternal destiny but rewrites that person's emotional and spiritual history in this life. He also taught that grace is God's great movement toward the sinner. It is not we who run to God. It is God who runs to us. David said, "Your love will reach me." And Spurgeon explained that this is the essence of grace. God finds man before man realizes he is lost. Grace anticipates. Grace precedes. Grace arrives first. And therefore no one can boast of having found God, for it was God who found each one of us first. We are the fruit of grace that initiates, not of the force that seeks. Spurgeon asserted that grace acts not only as forgiveness, but as strength. It not only erases the past, it empowers for the future. Grace doesn't just say, "I forgive you," but also, "Now get up and walk with me." Therefore, he insisted that Christians cannot live relying on their own abilities, because grace is the fuel of the spiritual journey. Without grace, faith becomes a burden. With grace, faith becomes rest. And Spurgeon valued this rest not as passivity, but as active confidence, a soul that knows God can do what man cannot. Another central point in his teaching is that God's grace is too profound to be explained solely by human logic. It confronts our self-righteousness, destroys our spiritual pride, and reveals that salvation is not a work, but a gift. Spurgeon said that those who try to earn God's favor through human effort end up frustrated because grace does not operate within merit. It operates within need. The greater the need, the greater the grace manifested. And those who recognize their need are precisely those who most experience the depth of this mercy. Spurgeon also said that grace heals broken identities. Many Christians carry old guilt, emotional stains, painful memories, and distorted perceptions of themselves. But grace enters precisely into those inner places that no one sees and says, "You are not what you made yourself. You are who God says you are." This spiritual redefinition is the foundation of new life. Grace not only saves the soul, it saves self-esteem, it saves vision, it saves the heart. It rebuilds what sin has deteriorated and restores to the Christian their true identity as a beloved child. He asserted that grace always surprises us because it never follows human logic. God chose David, who was unlikely. He chose Gideon, who was fearful. He chose Paul, who was a persecutor. He chose Jacob, who was a deceiver. And according to Spurgeon, he continues to choose in this way, reaching those whom no one would choose, transforming those whom no one would believe in, restoring those whom everyone would discard. God's grace does not follow the world's criteria. It follows the criteria of the divine heart. Spurgeon emphasized that grace is not weak. It is powerful. It is not a delicate feeling from God, but the force that undoes spiritual chains, destroys addictions, heals traumas, and uplifts destinies. When someone says, "I can't change," grace responds, "I can transform you." It's not about human strength. It's about divine intervention. Grace does what discipline cannot sustain and what willpower cannot achieve. It enters where no one else enters and touches what no one else can touch. Another profound point was Spurgeon's conviction that grace not only receives us, it keeps us. He said that many Christians live in fear of losing their faith but forget that grace is what sustains the heart. We do not remain steadfast because we hold on to God, but because God holds on to us. The hand that reaches out is the same hand that preserves, and the Christian who understands this finally finds rest. It is not fear that keeps faith alive, but grace that keeps the Christian steadfast. Spurgeon also said that grace is patient. It doesn't demand immediate growth. It doesn't condemn slow pace. It doesn't despise silent progress. Grace accompanies, guides, molds, and matures. God doesn't work in haste. He works with depth. He knows exactly the day to touch, the day to confront, the day to heal, and the day to strengthen. Grace doesn't accelerate us. It transforms us. And every true transformation has divine timing embedded within it. Spurgeon asserted that God's grace is greater than any human guilt. He said that there are sins that man cannot forget, but that God has already erased. There are memories that hurt us, but that the blood of Christ has already purified. There are feelings of unworthiness that we carry for years, but that grace undoes in minutes. Grace not only erases records, it heals wounds. And for Spurgeon, this healing is one of the greatest expressions of divine love. One of the pillars of his sermons is that grace is irresistible when illuminated by the Holy Spirit. He explained that when God reveals his love, the soul cannot resist because it finally sees the truth about itself and about God. It is not spiritual manipulation, it is revelation, and when the soul sees Christ as he is, it abandons its defenses and surrenders deeply. Grace attracts, grace calls, grace awakens, grace conquers. Spurgeon also said that grace is what sustains the Christian in the midst of crises. He recognized that life doesn't always cooperate, that there are days when pain dominates and darkness seems to be the only thing visible. But in those moments, he reminded us, grace is sufficient. Not sufficient to remove all suffering immediately, but sufficient to sustain the heart while the suffering lasts. Grace is God's invisible shoulder, holding up the soul when it thinks it is going to fall. Another striking point is that Spurgeon believed grace transforms how we see God. Before understanding grace, many Christians see God as a rigid judge. After grace is revealed, God is seen as a loving Father, the same God, but from a different perspective. Grace doesn't change God, it changes our vision. It opens the heart to an intimate, deep, and secure relationship. He also said that grace is humble. It doesn't impose itself. It doesn't show off. It doesn't boast. Grace works in silence, in internal processes, in subtle changes. When someone realizes it, they have already been transformed. Grace molds character, refines emotions, heals relationships, disciplines thoughts, and guides decisions, almost always without fanfare. It's like water that erodes rock without making a sound. Spurgeon asserted that grace is the foundation of Christian joy, not superficial joy, but deep joy, which rests on the fact that we are loved despite ourselves. He said that human sorrow loses its power when confronted with the truth of grace, and that no one who understands grace remains trapped in despair for long, because grace restores light to the heart. Another important focus is that grace invites us to live free from comparison. Spurgeon said that the Christian who understands grace knows that God does not operate on human scales. He distributes gifts, callings, rhythms, and processes according to his wisdom. And so we are free to follow our own path instead of competing with the path of others. Grace liberates us from comparison because it anchors us in who God has called us to be. Spurgeon also said that grace is what keeps us humble. He believed that a true awareness of grace prevents spiritual pride because it reminds us that nothing we have comes from ourselves. Life, faith, hope, forgiveness, transformation, everything is the fruit of God's hand. And whoever recognizes this lives with constant gratitude. This gratitude becomes a spiritual fragrance, an atmosphere that calms the soul and transforms environments. Another profound point was that for Spurgeon, grace not only transforms individuals, it transforms generations. A person touched by grace can break cycles of pain, guilt, addiction, and emotional destruction. Grace enters a life and changes entire destinies. It has transgenerational reach. The grace that touches you today may be the same grace that will redeem your children tomorrow. He also said that grace illuminates the future. We are not driven by uncertainty. We are guided by God's faithfulness. Grace tells us not only where we came from, but where we are going. And when the heart understands this, anxiety loses its voice. Grace shows us that the future does not depend on our control but on the hand that guides us. Spurgeon asserted that grace works silent miracles every day. A miracle is not just physical healing. It is forgiveness granted, renewed strength, rekindled courage, inexplicable peace, and restored hope. Miracles don't only happen in the extraordinary, they happen in the everyday. Grace transforms the ordinary into the sacred. Another essential point is that Spurgeon taught that grace calls us to belong. We do not belong to sin, nor to the past, nor to circumstances. We belong to God, and He calls us by name. Grace gives us a place, a voice, an identity, and a promise. We are part of the divine family, and this truth changes everything. Spurgeon also said that grace is God's answer to human emptiness. Where there is a hole in the soul, grace fills it. Where there is silence, grace speaks. Where there is hopelessness, grace flourishes. And where there is deep pain, grace builds deep healing. Grace never wastes suffering. It transforms suffering into testimony. Finally, Spurgeon concluded that to live by grace is to live resting in God's arms. It is not passivity, but trust. It is not indifference, but surrender. It is not weakness, but spiritual strength. Grace is the environment where the soul flourishes, where fear loses its power, where guilt disappears, and where love becomes the foundation. To live by grace is to live as one who knows that God not only saved us, He continues to sustain us, guide us, and mold us daily. According to Spurgeon, grace is the bridge that connects human misery to the perfect heart of God. It doesn't wait for man to improve, fix himself up, stabilize himself, or cleanse himself. It enters precisely where the soul is fallen, confused, or wounded. Grace doesn't require ladders, it descends itself. That's why Spurgeon said that no one is too far away to be reached and no one is too close not to need reaching. Grace is always divine movement toward those who cannot move themselves. He also taught that grace resolves inner conflicts that the mind cannot solve. There are wounds that do not heal with time, memories that do not disappear with willpower, and guilt that does not vanish with justifications. Grace does not negotiate with these pains. It enters, touches, and transforms. It acts as a light that reveals and as an oil that heals. Where there is a crack, it seals. Where there is emptiness, it fills. Where there is shame, it covers with love. Spurgeon said that grace is not just a moment, it's an environment. It's the place where the Christian soul lives, breathes, matures, and develops. Just as a fish cannot survive out of water, a Christian cannot flourish outside of grace. Everything we try to do away from it becomes a burden. Everything we do within it becomes lightness. Grace is the spiritual air that prevents the soul from suffocating in pain, legalism, or excessive self-criticism. Another strong point is that grace reveals the true nature of God. Many people carry distorted images of the Lord, distant, demanding, severe, reclusive. But Spurgeon said that to know grace is to know the heart of God, a heart that inclines, that embraces, that waits patiently, that does not tire of starting over as many times as necessary. Grace shows that God not only tolerates His children, He loves them deeply. Spurgeon asserted that grace reshapes trajectories. Some people live believing they have wasted too much time, failed too much, and squandered too many opportunities. But grace interrupts this narrative with the authority of heaven, saying, "I make all things new." Grace restores wasted years, lost feelings, and destroyed dreams. It doesn't just rebuild what existed, it builds what never existed. Another essential point in Spurgeon's teaching is that grace liberates from spiritual perfectionism. He said that many Christians lose joy because they try to conquer what Christ has already conquered. They try to deserve what is already a gift. They try to prove what God never demanded. Grace calls us to live the faith lightly, with confidence, and with the awareness that God works in us, not because of us, but despite us. He also said that grace is active, not passive. It doesn't leave us standing still. It propels us forward. The more we understand God's love, the more we desire to obey Him, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude, not out of fear, but out of inner transformation. Grace doesn't exempt us from holiness. It empowers us for it. It's a change that springs from within, not an imposition from the outside. Spurgeon explained that grace is the answer to human insecurities. When someone feels incapable, grace says, "My strength is made perfect in your weakness." When someone feels impure, grace says, "The blood of Christ cleanses you." When someone feels hopeless, grace says, "I know the plans I have for you." Grace replaces inner lies with eternal truths. Another powerful point was his assertion that grace always leads us back to Christ. No matter the pain, no matter the failure, no matter the mistake, no matter the fear, grace is the path that redirects the heart to Jesus. Spurgeon said that a Christian may stumble, but grace ensures that he will never be completely lost. Grace is a spiritual compass that does not let the soul forget the way. And finally, Spurgeon said that grace not only saves, it sustains us until the last day. It accompanies us in victories and comforts us in failures. It strengthens us on the journey and consoles us in our falls. And when the Christian reaches the end of his life, he discovers that his entire journey can be summarized in a single phrase: "Thus far, the Lord has helped me." Grace is the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story of every child of God. Spurgeon asserted that grace not only enters the life of a Christian, it remains. The continuous presence of grace is what ensures that the spiritual journey does not become a cycle of highs and lows driven by human effort. Grace accompanies, sustains, guides, and surrounds like an invisible shield. It is the hand that prevents deep falls and the breath that rekindles the flame when the soul seems to go out. For Spurgeon, the persistence of grace is the greatest proof that God never abandons the process he has begun. He also said that grace works behind the scenes of the soul, where no one sees. While we try to measure our progress from visible results, God works in depths that cannot be quantified. Grace shapes thoughts, heals emotions, reorganizes perceptions, confronts inner lies, and expands our capacity to love and forgive. It is a silent but permanent work. Spurgeon reminded us that the greatest evidence of grace is not what we do, it is who we become. Another profound point in his writings is that grace leads us down paths we wouldn't choose, but that we need to walk. David, Joseph, Paul, all were guided along unexpected routes, and Spurgeon explained that God uses grace not only to deliver us from pain, but to mold us through it. Grace doesn't avoid processes, it makes processes bearable and meaningful. The soul that lives by grace doesn't fear the path because it knows it doesn't walk alone. Spurgeon also said that grace awakens spiritual sensitivity. When the heart is hardened by the weight of life, grace softens it. When the mind is weary of struggle, grace renews it. When thoughts are lost in darkness, grace illuminates them. He explained that grace acts like gentle rain on dry ground, silent, constant, restorative. Little by little, that which seemed dead begins to bloom again. Another central teaching is that grace breaks the cycle of self-sufficiency. Spurgeon said that one of the hardest prisons to break is the need to control everything. Grace confronts this impulse, reminding us that we are not gods of our own lives. It calls us to trust, surrender, and rest. Grace teaches us to live less by force and more by dependence, and it is precisely in dependence that we discover true strength. He also asserted that grace is not fragile in the face of human failings. On the contrary, it is most evident precisely where there is weakness. Spurgeon said that God is not impressed by our ability, but is compassionate towards our limitations. He knew that we would fall, that we would doubt, that we would falter, and yet he chose to love us. Grace is woven precisely at this point where human frailty meets divine faithfulness. Spurgeon emphasized that grace continues to operate even when we are unaware of it. Often, Christians think they are distant from God when, in reality, they are being silently carried by grace. It protects us from decisions we shouldn't make, closes paths that would destroy us, prevents connections that would hurt us, and opens doors at the right time. Grace governs the behind-the-scenes aspects of life with supernatural precision. He also said that grace transforms the motivation of the heart. Before grace, we obey out of fear, guilt, or obligation. After grace, we obey out of love. Duty becomes pleasure. Burden becomes privilege. Discipline becomes a natural response. Grace changes the motive, and when the motive changes, everything changes. Obedience ceases to be effort and becomes an expression of gratitude. Another profound point made by Spurgeon is that grace is an environment of emotional healing. He recognized that many Christians carry unconfessed pain, insecurities, rejections, traumas, and fears. Grace enters these areas with divine gentleness and does what no human therapy can do. It heals the root. It touches the exact point where the soul was wounded, and there it plants restoration. True healing is applied grace. Spurgeon taught that grace never withdraws. It is not ashamed of our falls, does not tire of our weaknesses, and does not abandon us when we err. God's faithfulness is a conviction that grace reinforces daily in the Christian's soul. Even when we flee, God follows us. Even when we give up, God persists. Grace is persistent and patient, and this patience is the foundation of hope. He also asserted that grace redefines failures. What seemed like defeat takes on new meaning when passed through God's hands. Spurgeon said that many failures are merely detours that God uses to teach, mature, and align. Grace transforms falls into lessons, wounds into messages, and mistakes into bridges to higher places. Grace does not deny failure. It redeems it. Spurgeon said that grace trains our gaze. It teaches us to see God in details that previously went unnoticed. In the still breath, in the closing door, in the healing embrace, in the unexpected advice, in the silent deliverance. Grace opens our eyes to the ordinary, revealing that God's extraordinary is scattered throughout the routine of those who know how to observe. He also said that grace strengthens the soul during long periods of waiting. Waiting in itself is exhausting, but grace transforms waiting into growth. It teaches patience, molds character, and deepens faith. Spurgeon reminded us that God doesn't delay, He trains, and grace is the environment where this training happens safely and purposefully. Spurgeon emphasized that grace is a shield against destructive self-criticism. The Christian who understands grace does not live condemning himself, because he knows that God does not condemn him. Grace silences internal voices of accusation and declares over the soul, "You are loved, you are forgiven, you are sustained." When grace prevails, guilt loses ground. Another key point was that grace gives us the courage to start over. After a mistake, the human tendency is to give up or hide, but grace finds us, lifts us up, and pushes us forward. Spurgeon said that grace gives us a reason to try again because it ensures that God does not write stories with the ink of giving up, but with the ink of hope. He also asserted that grace transforms relationships. It gives us patience to forgive, humility to acknowledge mistakes, compassion to understand weaknesses, and wisdom to restore broken connections. Where there is grace, there is reconciliation. Where it is lacking, there is rupture. Grace mends what pride tears. Spurgeon said that grace frees us from the fear of the future. Those who live by grace know that tomorrow is not at the mercy of chance, but in the hands of a good God. This doesn't eliminate challenges, but it eliminates fear. Grace instills in the heart a tranquil, almost inexplicable confidence. It is the conviction that, whatever happens, God will be there. He also said that grace strengthens faith in times of spiritual darkness. Faith may waver, but grace remains stable. It holds the Christian until the light returns and keeps the heart warm while the cold wind blows. Grace is an anchor. When nothing seems firm, it is. Another point is that grace teaches us to love others with the same love we receive. Those who understand grace do not demand perfection, because they know they are not perfect. They do not judge quickly, because they know they too have stumbled. Grace creates a gentle heart, one that welcomes instead of hurting, that lifts up instead of crushing. Grace transforms us into mirrors of Christ Himself. Spurgeon also taught that grace increases the capacity to endure inevitable pain. There are sufferings we cannot avoid: losses, farewells, frustrations, diagnoses, harsh realities. But grace strengthens from within, allowing the soul to remain standing even when life collapses. Grace is spiritual resilience. He said that grace accompanies every stage of life. In youth, it guides. In adulthood, it sustains. In old age, it consoles. It never ages, never weakens, never loses its vigor. Grace is as eternal as the God who grants it. The Christian lives surrounded, enveloped, and sustained by an invisible force that never fails. Another essential point is that Spurgeon saw grace as a bridge between human imperfection and divine purpose. Without grace, we would never be able to fulfill what God has planned. With grace, every step, every choice, every act of faith becomes possible. Grace not only calls us, it empowers us. Finally, Spurgeon concluded that grace is the living testimony that God does not give up on us. No matter how many times we stumble, how many doubts we carry, or how many dark days we face, grace persists, crosses walls, reaches depths, and remains. Grace is the echo of heaven continually saying, "I am still here," and this truth transforms everything. Before we conclude this message, it is essential to make room for a narrative, because Spurgeon believed that some spiritual truths are not fully understood by the mind until they are felt by the heart. And stories have this power. They translate profound concepts into vivid images that transcend logic and reach the soul. just as grace finds us in the moments we least expect it. The story you are about to hear was written to touch inner places you may not have visited in a long time, places where you still demand too much of yourself, where you feel too unworthy, where you believe you've squandered too many opportunities, places where grace wants to enter, but you still hesitate to open them. Therefore, before listening, allow yourself to take a deep breath, disarm your heart, relax your shoulders. This story is not merely illustrative, it is a spiritual mirror. It speaks of a character, but it could speak of any one of us. It reveals how God works silently, how he bends down to the broken, how he restores what seemed impossible. Now, with an open heart, allow this narrative to speak directly to you. The man who destroyed everything he touched. Long, elaborate, and in-depth version. There was a man known by a cruel nickname, the spoilsport, not because he was malicious, but because he seemed to carry a kind of emotional bad luck. Everything he started, he didn't finish. Everything he built crumbled. Relationships failed, jobs slipped away, opportunities died at his fingertips. He tried, but always found himself back at the same point, tired, frustrated, and ashamed of himself. He believed there was something wrong with him. Not emotionally, spiritually. He believed that God no longer saw him. Or worse, that God saw him and had already given up on him. This thought had become his shadow. He didn't tell anyone, but inside he repeated, "Maybe I'm a lost cause." One day, after yet another painful failure, he walked to an old wooden bridge near his town. It was a quiet place where he always went when he didn't know where else to turn. There, gazing at the dark water, he finally broke down. He didn't scream, he didn't curse. He just cried. He cried like someone carrying decades of accumulated disappointment. He cried like someone who had given up fighting against himself. As the tears fell, he murmured something he didn't even know was inside him. "God, why do you keep letting me live like this?" He wasn't expecting an answer, but God doesn't need human expectations to act. In the profound silence of that place, something gentle began to touch his mind. It wasn't an audible voice. It was more like a memory he didn't know he still had. He saw himself as a child, sitting in a small church, listening to his grandmother repeat, "The grace of God never gives up on anyone." That phrase rekindled something in him. An interesting fact, a slight irritation, a spark of hope that he tried to extinguish but couldn't. In the following days, something different began to happen. There was no instant miracle, no visible transformation, but within him, a small thing began to stir, a desire to talk to God, even if it was with anger, a desire to try again, even if with fear, a desire to believe, even if only for 2 minutes a day. Grace had begun to work, and grace works like this, silently, without asking permission, without announcing its arrival. It enters slowly, looking at the shards without disgust for them, without fear of them, without haste to put them back together. Grace does not call a lost cause that which God created to be a poem. A month later, the man was invited to help renovate a community shelter. It wasn't a job, it wasn't paid, it was just volunteer work. But he accepted, and in that environment, something peculiar happened. Nobody there knew him as the one who messes things up. He was just one more. One more who tried to help, one more who carried boxes, one more who laughed when someone made a joke. It was the first time in years that he didn't feel like a burden to the world. While he was painting a wall, an elderly lady sat down next to him and said out of the blue, "Funny, sometimes the best walls are painted by hands that have trembled a lot." He smiled, thinking it was a beautiful phrase, but that stuck in her heart. Days later, the same lady called him and said, "My son, only God's grace can lift people up again. And you are getting up, even without realizing it." He didn't know why he cried, but he cried. He cried as if finally understanding that he is not being watched over by a judge, but accompanied by a father. Gradually, he began to realize something surprising. Grace was rebuilding his self-perception. He no longer saw himself as a walking failure. He began to see himself as someone God still wanted to teach, shape, and transform. The shadow he carried began to dissipate. For the first time, he believed that his story was not destined to repeat the same chapters. Time passed. He made another mistake. Of course he did. But the difference was that now he wasn't drowning in guilt. He ran to God. He ran to grace. He ran to the only place that finally seemed safe. Until one day, returning home, crossing the same bridge where he had previously collapsed, he stopped and smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because he finally understood. I used to think I destroyed everything I touched, but God is rebuilding everything He touches in me. And there he discovered the central truth of Spurgeon's book. God's grace not only reaches us, it transforms us as we walk with it. It restores us while we live. She catches us while we stumble. She rewrites us as we breathe. And above all, grace never gives up. If this message spoke to you today, if any part of it touched your soul, illuminated a thought, calmed a fear, restored a hope, then allow this experience not to end here. God's grace is movement. It is flow, it is continuity, and this channel exists precisely for that reason, to lead you daily to real encounters with the love that has restored so many lives, and continues to restore yours. If you're not already subscribed, I invite you, with all the sensitivity of the Spirit, to subscribe now. Here we delve together into the works of Charles Spurgeon, but always with practical applications for real life. Every day you'll find a new video, a new book, a new revelation capable of transforming your heart, rekindling your faith, and reminding you that you don't walk alone. This is a space of grace, healing, and presence. And before we continue, please leave your comment. Which other book by Spurgeon would you like to see explained and applied here on the channel? Your comment is not just participation, it's spiritual discernment. It's how we understand together what direction the Holy Spirit wants for future videos. Every request, every suggestion, every question helps us reach even more lives with depth and purpose. May the grace that touched you today continue to accompany you in places where no one sees, strengthening you in moments that no one understands, sustaining you in battles that no one imagines. May the God of grace surround you, renew you, and remind you daily, you are not alone, you are not lost, you are not forgotten, you are sustained by grace, yesterday, today, and forever. Now, wherever you are, allow your soul to slow down. Take a deep breath. Let go of the weight you may not even have known you were carrying. This is a time for connection, not for effort, not for demands, not for performance, just presence. Lord God, we come before you with humility and gratitude, acknowledging that all that we are and all that we have comes from your grace. We have not arrived here through merit or our own strength, but because your love reached us when we no longer knew how to continue. Today we thank you for the grace that saves, the grace that sustains, and the grace that endures. Father, visit now every heart that prays with us. You know the stories that no one else knows, the pains that haven't been spoken, the failures that still weigh heavily, and the guilt that persists in accusing. May your grace envelop each of these areas. Where there is shame, pour out forgiveness. Where there is weariness, pour out rest. Where there is fear, pour out security. Where there is a feeling of abandonment, pour out the certainty of your constant presence. Lord, there are people here who have believed for too long that they have gone too far, made too many mistakes, or missed too many opportunities. Today, by your grace, break that lie. Declare over each life that your love has no expiration date and that your mercy is renewed every morning. Let no one leave this prayer believing they are a lost cause, because grace has never given up and never will. Holy Spirit, deeply touch those who are tired of trying to be strong. Teach them to rest in you. Teach them to trust where they once tried to control. Teach them to accept love that doesn't need to be earned. May grace heal perfectionism, silence destructive self-criticism, and bring lightness to the hearts of those who demand too much of themselves. Father, restore now the identity of your children. May each person here see themselves as you see them, loved, chosen, forgiven, cared for, and sustained. May grace wash away painful memories, heal old wounds, and bring peace to inner places that still ache. Where there was breakage, rebuild. Where there was delay, accelerate with purpose. Where there was confusion, bring clarity. Lord, seal this prayer with living hope. Hope that does not depend on circumstances, but on your faithfulness. May each person here know that tomorrow is not a distant prospect. It is in your hands. May they walk confidently, not because everything is resolved, but because grace accompanies them step by step. May their faith not be sustained by the fear of making mistakes, but by the certainty of being loved. And finally, by the grace of God, may each life here leave this moment with a lighter heart, a more tranquil mind, and a stronger spirit. May your grace continue to work when the video ends, when routine returns, when silence arrives. May it be a constant companion, a safe haven, and an inexhaustible source of strength. We surrender everything to you, past, present, and future, trusting that he who began the good work is faithful to complete it. In the name of Jesus, amen.